Hello, it's Richard Pears of FinextraTV, and joined this morning by the CEO of Icebreaker One, Gavin Starks. Good morning.
Good morning.
Great to see you. We had a great chat last week, and as ever, wanted to get out your information to the Finextra audience. Tell us a little bit about your background, which is so important, I think, to where you are now, and then a little bit on Icebreaker One and what your plan is.
Certainly. Well, the thing that's been a constant for me over the last few decades now has been data and how to use data to create impact. And that's resulted in me creating over a dozen companies, of which Icebreaker One now is, I think, number 14, but also involved heavily in climate change along the way, and helping a couple of major initiatives get off the ground, one being the Open Data Institute, which we set up there, and I ran for 4 years with Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt. And then following on from that, in co-chairing the development of the open banking standard, which is now regulated in the UK, and continue to work on that with the Financial Conduct Authority through their open finance advisory groups. And what we're doing with Icebreaker now is to try and make data work harder to help us deliver net zero. And that really has a strong focus for us in the financial sector, and trying to bring together the different threads here across sectors. How can we get better information out of the energy sector, out of transport, agriculture, water, out of the built environment, so that people can design financial instruments that enable us to create demonstrable net zero. And it's that word demonstrable that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and that's absolutely sort of totally on the mission of FinextraTV. And the reason I'm so excited about it is when I was at Microsoft, I kind of looked after open banking and fintech and core banking. So I know what you mean by these terms. But just in case anybody isn't clear, just give us the quick summary of what was needed that drove ODI and open banking, etc.
Sure. Well, I think here often data is treated as a technology problem, and the last thing it is a technology problem. We've had the technology for data sharing for decades, and the web is the most successful information architecture in history. There are billions of websites, hundreds of billions of bits of information flying around, and it's ubiquitous. It's more than half the world's population have access. So I think the question there is not so much about a technology lead, but really what's the user need? What do people need to do with this information? How can we make better decisions? And actually, that's more of a cultural shift than a technology problem. So with open banking, the mandate for that was led by Treasury. Treasury said that they wanted to see better interoperability across the banking sector, and appointed myself as co-chair, and we put together a team of about 150 people from across the sector to really work through the legal issues, the data rights issues. Obviously, in the background there, you had GDPR and other EU regulation like PSD2. And so how these policy instruments come together with the business model. And I think, there's been a lot of failed starts with sort of data initiatives where they say, well, we should open up the data. And actually, you have to answer the question, why? Who's going to benefit? And as a business, what's in it for me? And so both at the Open Data Institute, which was government funded, we were looking very much at what's the business case for open data. And let's be clear about what we mean by open data. There's a lot of confusion. Open data itself is data that anyone can use for any purpose for free. So obviously that doesn't apply to things like your personal bank statements. So we call the data spectrum, if you like, here of open data, shared data, and closed data. Open data is at one end, anyone can use it, and you don't want to charge for that. And then this huge ecosystem in the middle of shared data, and open banking creates the trust framework that enables organizations to share data with each other without the sky falling. So it addresses liability, addresses the data management processes, is aligned with the policy instruments, and really looks after, I'd say, both the customer and the business.
Yeah.
And it's really critical. I think that there's a lot of, again, some misunderstandings about what open banking is. For me, it's a business-to-business standard that enables consumer data sharing. And what we're doing with Icebreaker One is to try and take these principles forward and say, let's work out how we can share this information, for example, across the energy networks, in a way that enables competition, in a way that enables efficiencies, in a way that enables innovation without undermining everybody's privacy or commercial interests or intellectual property along the way. So I think here there's a framework, and I think, again, just to give another important pointer, with open banking, the mechanism doesn't try and put all the data into one place. It leaves the data at the edge. It leaves it with the corporate entity that holds it already, in this case, the banks. And it creates the permission structure, it creates the rules of engagement, and it effectively does the kind of KYC piece between organizations, say this organization is allowed to access information across the system, and here are the common rules. And so we shifted from an environment where people were already sharing data, they already had the technology infrastructure to share data. But what open banking does is says, let's have a common set of rules, so we're all working against the same baseline. So effectively, we moved from lots of bilateral contracts to a single framework, which then enables many more organizations to engage. And there's now hundreds of fintech companies in the open banking system, and millions of people who are using it to help manage their own personal data.
And it's transformed how companies operate, isn't it? With marketplaces, which are then, connecting with those fintechs, and it's allowing, as you say, all of that secure permission data exchange to be going on across, a healthy ecosystem. And now, of course, that's moved on to open finance, which goes further than the payment sort of origination, if you will. And that then takes us into the world, perhaps, of commercial banking, investment banking, asset management, and so forth. And so that's where, when you take that wonderful blueprint that you've just outlined and you look at it and you say, well, we've put these kind of permissions and rails, etc., in place, yet we have a problem of getting data from supply chains, etc., into decision making for capital allocation. Why don't we use the same principles, rules, and rails? How far does it go to allow you to achieve that? And tell us about your energy initiative to now sort of unpack it.
Certainly. Well, over the last 6 months, we've been very fortunate. We've entered into a UK national competition programme called Modernising Energy Data Access, which is funded through UKRI and SBRI. And we've just won that competition. And the outcome of that is we're going to roll out open energy in the same framework or similar framework to open banking, with some significant differences. Banking was very different in two major ways. One, it was driven by Treasury. So people were kind of strongly encouraged to get to the table. The second piece is it was quite a simple use case in many ways, even though it took many hundreds of people many years to work it all out. But we were effectively just dealing with a relatively small set of use cases around bank statements, transactional information, payments information. With energy, you've got thousands of use cases. So you can't take the same approach of saying, well, let's just have one API and one technical architecture for the whole thing. But again, it comes back to the point of it's not a technology problem. What we want to see is effectively a number of kind of sequenced elements here that unlock the data marketplace in a scalable, and I talk about web scale, in a web scale way. We didn't start off by saying to everybody, when you build a website, you've got to put a copy of it into this portal. We said, build a website and publish it online, and then we can build a search engine to come and find it.
Yeah.
And so the first thing that we've built with the Open Energy program is an energy data search engine. So the call to action, if you like, is for the energy sector companies to publish metadata, which is data that describes the data you've got, in a machine readable format that we can find. Because if we can find it, then we can help other people find it. So we can index it and make it searchable in the same way you would use Google search and so on. So that's part one, is just discoverability. And a lot of people think this is a solved problem. Technically, it's a solved problem. Culturally and operationally, it's miles away from being a solved problem. So the first part of that is just say, can we just publish machine readable data that tells us what you have?
Yeah.
At that point, we can then provide pointers to whoever's looking for it and say, well, okay, how is it licensed? So if it's open data, if anyone can use it for any purpose for free, we don't really need to do much, just publish it. There's plenty of mechanisms now that enable you to do that, and it's effectively free. There's web services out there, you can put data in and just get on with it. The interesting bit comes when you say, well, anyone can use it apart from those people, or those people need to pay, or actually we've got some terms and conditions we want to wrap around that particular use case. As soon as you move away from anything but open, you need a trust framework around that. So what we've built is the foundations built on the similar principles as open banking to enable organizations to connect with each other in a trusted manner. And the work we're just about to embark on, in fact, we started the project this week, is to put together our advisory groups with industry specialists to help us really understand what the user needs are from the market point of view. And our role here, again, we don't ever want to host any data. It's really critical. As soon as we host data, we're going to compete with somebody.
Yeah.
We want to help wire it up. So this is all about creating the wiring and the rails, if you like, to enable that data exchange between this many-to-many world. And one example there is if you are looking at the future of energy distribution in the UK, you've got this very different environment. We don't just have a small number of large power stations. We've got a very large number of wind turbines and micro-generation solar panels right down to the domestic level. And then at the consumer level and the business level, you've got smart meters. So suddenly you've got millions of bits of data flying around and a very complex ecosystem. And then from the national grid's point of view, how do you load balance that? How from a local authority's point of view, do you look at what's called a flexibility market? How do you create all of these different sources and users? And it's not just domestic properties anymore or commercial properties, it's also vehicles as we move to EVs. So it's suddenly the complexity of this goes up exponentially. And so the idea that we're all going to have be able to negotiate all the contracts we need with everybody else is not the journey we want to go on. And you really work out those use cases and create common standards across the market.
Yeah, and it's music to my ears because I sort of, my own little way sort of been banging the same drum. But it's what's interesting as well, everything you talk about, it's really the change process. It's not the technology, it's the culture. And so many people still think you need to build a sort of golden master database somewhere in the sky. You spoke in one of your documents about the sort of change process. Let's hear about that, because again, I think it draws on a lot of that experience of the fintech innovation, absolute phenomena that happened since around 2008 as a creative change process. Tell us a bit more about that and how you see it applying in this space.
Certainly. Well, I think at the heart of it, what we did it with Open Energy is we created a use case. So how would a local authority start planning around the installation of heat pumps across their region? How do they finance that? How do they know if they've got enough capacity on their local energy grids? What are the transmission constraints? And just sitting there as a local authority trying to plan anything, it's incredibly complex. And so how do you bring that information together? So at the heart of this is really the user. And there are many different types of user in this value chain. So part of it is unpacking what is the value chain for data exchange. Who is it at which part of this ecosystem? And with the experience we had with open banking, a lot of the banks were quite resistant. They're like, well, we're already sharing data. Is it really a problem? And we said, well, a lot of the processes were, it's not that people weren't sharing data, but it wasn't legal. And there were very few modes of redress for the end customer. And there was, a lot of gaps. So I think really trying to bring us into the modern digital age is really what we've seen over the last decade or so, is policy finally catching up with the way that the internet already works. And it's taken a long time. But for me, open banking is really the first time we've put the technology and policy on an equal footing. And then the question has to be, how does industry get engaged with this in a way that's meaningful? And there's really only three parameters that we're looking at here. One is, how do we reduce risk? how do we increase efficiency, or how do we increase revenue? How do we, and through innovation in whatever form. And at the heart of this, you've got really material physical world impacts. With banking, we have to have very robust processes, because you're keeping the economy on the road. It's not Netflix, where if you lose a few movies, yes, some people will be annoyed, but you don't have any sort of systemic collapse. Similarly with energy, it's literally keeping the lights on as we scale into a net zero future. And there are thousands or millions of assets across that ecosystem. So as an asset manager, or if you're looking at how to deploy capital in terms of capital allocation plans, how do you make decisions at the moment that are going to deliver net zero in a way that you can prove? Because from an investor point of view, and from a stakeholder point of view, and from a shareholder point of view, the evidence is going to be really important. And it's not necessarily, I think we've got a lot of gaps at the moment.
Yeah. And I think it's that sort of, that if you're going to look at the value of the company and its impact on physical and transition risks, you've got to know where its assets are and how they're being impacted by climate change. And there's a definite opacity in the access to data around assets, and even worse when you get to supply chain data, which is more, where you can see the real impact of transition. So what I really like about what you're doing is as people say, well, I can't give you that because it's my private and proprietary data, go right back to the beginning of your conversation. Banks have found a way to exchange this data from bank to intermediary to consumer, and those rails, have not caused any problems. So let's apply them here.
I think it's absolutely right. And I've been around the block on this before. More than about 15 years ago, I set up a carbon footprinting company. And there we aggregated all of the different carbon emissions reporting standards and calculation methodologies in the world, and we put them behind one system. So we could you could just type in 100 kilograms of steel, it would tell you the carbon impact against all the methodologies that existed. And now at that time, that was an incredibly advanced service. But what it really highlighted is that knowing the answer to those kind of questions, while they were mandatory as part of the different reporting frameworks, didn't create any change, or didn't create change at scale that we wanted to see. So there, again, having the technology or having access to the data doesn't necessarily drive the behavior change. And with new initiatives like the TCFD, Task Force for Climate Disclosure, which the UK has now signed up to, as has New Zealand, they're going to drive a lot of data flow, but it's still retroactive. It's annual reporting retrospectively, and there is, as far as I'm aware, no data standardization around the inputs to the reporting process. And so the challenges that we will absolutely face, and you're already hearing this, and you mentioned it, around things like supply chain data, where you're looking at your scope 3 emissions, horrifically complicated, and can't be solved, in my opinion, again, having tried it. I don't think it can be solved by a single platform approach, or even creating a common reporting framework. And initiatives like Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, been going for many years, are now publishing some of their output reports as open data, but it's still not something that's really scaled. I think there's fewer than 10,000 organizations that report into CDP. How do we scale that to 200 million companies?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very limited number of companies doing an annual disclosure, and people are focused on, as you say, just the standardization of the disclosure and the reporting, and really, looking at, as you've just described here, the intelligent edge of sensors in everything. Actually, how do you bring that data in, which is currently being collected through supply chains, and then actually put that out as machine readable data, which in a secure and permission way, which can give us a much better dynamic, real-time sort of environment of pricing risk.
Well, I think, again, coming back to the supply chain question, I've been through this, I feel, through various different lenses. Did quite a bit of work with the anti-modern slavery piece as well. And supply chain data is huge within that. Now, you kind of go in via this kind of CSR route of an organization, and everyone's super enthusiastic. As soon as you get to the supply chain manager, they're not allowed to share the information, and quite rightly, and it's competitively sensitive, a whole range of security reasons, lots and lots of reasons. So we need mechanisms to share, in some cases, the raw data, but also in other cases to securely share the answer to a question. Is it, because you don't need to reveal the underlying data to answer most of these questions. You could say, for example, is parameter X over a threshold or under it? And being able to query that in a secure environment, we can now do in a scalable way. And I think this is really where the opportunity for the financial community is in the design of insurance products or investment products, or looking at just capital allocation plans, is say, actually, we're going to mandate the delivery of this information. And what we're trying to do at Icebreaker One as an independent nonprofit, that's really critical to our positioning, is to say we can operationalize that in a neutral and secure way that we've got examples, obviously, with open banking being regulated, and Ofgem is part of the conversation with open energy, and we're looking forward to what may or may not need to be regulated in these contexts. And as we go through this, we've obviously got our eyes on all of these different categories around the built world, organisations like the Centre for Digital Built Britain, through to Treasury and so on, as how are we really going to deliver net zero in the timeframes that we need to? And this is broadly seen as the decade of action, and COVID's cost us quite heavily in its first year. So we've got a lot of work to do, but improving these information flows, I think my underlying principle here is data increases in value the more it's connected. So hoarding it doesn't create value, connecting it does.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, a great point on which to leave it. And I sort of start my day with a lot of buoyancy and enthusiasm, because, you're definitely, for my money, in the right direction. So for now, Gavin, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much.